If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel, as well as follow me and subscribe to me on all my other social media platforms. What's up, Thrashers, and welcome back once again to the ThrashManiac99 YouTube channel, and I am back with another discography ranking for you guys. It's been almost 2 months since the Anthrax ranking, and the reasons why it took so long to get to this one was computer issues that are seemingly now resolved, and just taking the time to check out a lot of these albums, because this is a big discography we're going to be talking about. As ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, the ThrashManiac99 YouTube channel proudly brings to you the Enslaved album ranking. Yes, this has been one that I've kind of looked forward to, but yet dread at the same time, because when it comes down to black metal or even progressive metal, one of the most consistent bands out there. Like, pretty much, spoiler alert, all 16 of these albums are fucking good. So this is probably going to be just as, if not tougher, than even the Immolation ranking I did earlier this summer. So, yeah, buckle up, grab yourself a drink and a snack, and let's have some fun. So, as far as how I got into Enslaved, or I first heard of Enslaved, first, I heard them off of Metal Headbanger's Journey, that documentary where you had Grudley and Ivar getting interviewed, and they had a couple of songs. And then, of course, YouTube compilations, checking out, like, best prog metal songs and seeing a couple of Enslaved tracks on that, or black metal songs, you would have some Enslaved on that. And then it was around the time of End Times coming out whenever I really kind of started to kind of take notice of Enslaved. However, it's been mostly the recent stuff I got into. I didn't get into any of the older stuff, mostly, until doing this discography ranking, and it was very enjoyable. I actually probably will be going after all these albums to add to the collection eventually. But for now, let's get into the history of the band. So, Enslaved formed out of Norway in 1991, with the original lineup consisting of vocalist and bassist Grutle Kylson, guitarist Ivar Bjørson, and drummer Trym Thorsen, who are three pretty big players in the Norwegian black metal scene, or really the Norwegian metal scene as a whole. And they started out a little bit more on the death metal side, like even Grutle said in interviews. They kind of started out from a very small Norwegian death metal scene, and this was just before black metal exploded in the Norwegian scene, and then suddenly they decided to stop playing death metal and go into this black metal sound that was really starting to catch fire. Which, don't want to be the one to repeat a joke, but let's just say the Norwegian black metal scene was hotter than a church in Norway. Forgive me. That was a lame joke, and why did I say it? But anyways, so So yeah, these three were working together, coming up with songs, and they kind of wanted to be a little bit different from the other Norwegian black metal scene. Like, musically, they still have all the trappings of the entire scene, but lyrically, image-wise, and even some of the instrumentation, they kind of went into a different direction. And that could be partially blamed on them being inspired by especially a band like Bathory. So, around 1992, 1993, Enslaved would actually get signed to Death Like Silence Productions, as they were discovered by Euronymous from Mayhem, who was looking to expand the label and catch up on some of these upcoming black metal bands from Scandinavia, whether it be Norway, Sweden, so on and so forth. So, they pretty much hit it off with Euronymous immediately as far as getting onto the label, and then we all know what happened with Euronymous in 93, but the label was still up, and while all this was going on, the band would go to the studio to work on their debut album, and then released in, well, I probably should have written the release dates for all this stuff. Released on January 22nd, 1994, we get the debut album, and I'm gonna try my best to pronounce this, Vikingligr Veldi. I probably butchered that, so forgive me, I'm gonna be butchering a lot of these Norwegian album titles. Thankfully, Metal Archives has the song titles in English. So, with all that said, let's get back to talking about this album. Now, as far as producer, they would get the legendary Python to do the production, who, of course, if you know about Norwegian black metal, he was kind of like, oh, I'm probably going to be crucified for saying this, Python was like the Scott Burns of Norway, because a lot of black metal bands from Norway went to Python and his studio to do some work, like Burzum, I think Early Immortal, Emperor, among many others. And Enslaved happened to come along for the ride, I should say. Now, the album is my number 7. I think this is an amazing debut. Like, this is actually, heading into the discography ranking, I had never listened to this album until getting into the ranking, and holy shit, I was blown away as to, like, how epic they made their black metal. Kind of almost in the vein of Emperor minus the symphonic aspects. In fact, it's kind of like a good, I would say, like yin and yang to Emperor, where they're both similar, at least early on, whereas Emperor went for the more symphonic approach. Enslaved kind of had a little bit of a folky approach. Like, there were some folky moments that kind of come up on here. Like in songs like Living Life Beneath the Hammer, Fires of Midgard, Heimdall, The Song Norway. Even though it's only 6 tracks, or no, it's just 5 tracks, excuse me. But they're all long songs. Like, in fact, the shortest track is Heimdall, which is just a little bit over 6 minutes, whereas the others clock in between, like, under 11 minutes and 11 and a half minutes. And actually, the song Norway, what an amazing black metal instrumental that was. Probably one of the best instrumentals you'll hear in black metal, I would say, at least in my opinion. But yeah, this was a hell of a start for a band that would go on to be one of the most consistent metal bands of all time. And this debut, my number 7. So, a very long time goes by, just kidding, about 6 months go by, and they're already back in the studio in the summer of '94, and also, by this point, Death Like Silence Productions is no more, so they needed to find a new home, so they would go over to Osmos Productions, and that label, I believe, is still around to this day. So Enslaved would go over to Osmos Productions for quite a long time, and they would go back to Python again, and they would go around June and July of '94, and then released on August 4th, 1994, we would get Frost. This is my number 4 album. I would say in terms of the more traditional black metal era of Enslaved, which is pretty much the 90s, this is the best work, I think. Like, this is, I would say, one of the best Norwegian black metal albums I have ever heard. Like, loads of dynamics, just tons of just epic moments, but yet you also get some, like, really evil-sounding parts. Now, this one, Metal Archives does not have in English, so I'm going to try my best, but the song Loki is one of the best songs Enslaved has ever done. Fenris, Yggdrasil, Jotunblood, how am I going to pronounce this one? Svartvitter. Like, again, top to bottom, just brilliant songwriting. And again, I actually completely forgot to mention this too when starting this out. These guys were, like, well, Grutle by this point is in his early 20s, whereas Ivar, he's a fucking teenager. I think he's not even out of high school yet. So yeah, he was very young when the band started. I believe he was only like 13, 14 years old when Enslaved started, because he's the youngin' of the band. And then Trim, I believe he was like 19, 20 years old at this point. But one thing I also forgot to mention with the debut that also gets exemplified here, Trim's drum work is just absolutely insane. And he would go on to be an Emperor, as well as a multitude of other Norwegian bands, whether in black metal or even death metal. But yeah, just great songwriting, epic songs. Again, still retaining a little bit of that folky vibe, but definitely for songs, like I said, Loki, Fenris, Yggdrasil, Jotun's Blood, Svart, Vidar. Again, just everything about this album's brilliant, and it is my number 4. So now we get into a little bit of a gap between albums. We would have a 2.5 to 3 year gap, and once again we would go back to Osmos Productions, once again Python doing the production, and they would work into the studio throughout most of '96, and then released on March 4th, I believe. Am I correct? No, March 17th, St. Paddy's Day of 1997, and we would get Eld. Now, Eld, this one fell for me in the ranking. This is my number 15. This is my second to last, but don't take that as an insult. I think this is still a very damn good album. Again, in that more black metal sound, this is still really good stuff. It's just, to me, isn't quite as memorable as the first 2 albums, whereas the first 2 albums, it was like a great, like a brother-sister kind of thing, where just both albums were just absolutely incredible, and just brought out so much for black metal with the Viking imagery, some of the folkiness that kind of comes in, some of the more epic sections coming in here and there. But this album, it does that, but again, just not quite as memorable. And in fact, like, it fell a lot whenever I was listening to the other albums. I just liked some of the other albums a little bit more than this, but still some really good songs like 793, the opening track. Oh god, Alpha Blot, Kavaserblad. Again, I try my best with these Norwegian pronunciations, I'm sorry. But, yeah, it just didn't quite stick out with me. And then also, I forgot to mention, after Frost, Trim would leave Enslaved, like I said, to go join Emperor. And his replacement would be Harald Helgeson. I think I got that right the first time, but Harald would come in as a drummer, and he puts on a really good performance. Granted, I prefer Trim because he's just an absolute maniac, but still, solid album. I put it at number 15. So, about a year and a half goes by, and more writing, recording, and I'm pretty sure they're touring at this point. And once again, Osmos Productions, when they go for the not the studio, but the label. Man, I am jumbling today. And that's because I'm a bit tired, so bear with me on that. But they would not go back to Python to do the production. Instead, they would actually work with one Peter Tägtgren from Hypocrisy to do the production for this album, as well as a couple more coming up. And, well, interesting results, I would say, in terms of production. And released on October 28th of 1998, we would get Bloodhem. This one's better. This is my number 14. I will say I think it is a better album. Actually, I think this is a great album in terms of the more black metal stuff. Like, definitely getting a little heavier, I would say, and that comes down to the production of Peter Tägtgren. He likes to make everything sound as heavy as possible depending on the subgenre of a band that he's working with. Whereas here, working with a black metal band, keeps it lo-fi, but adds a little bit more beef to the guitars, at least. More killer tracks on here, like I Linker Till Ragnarok, oh god, your Tycho Gods, and Ensus Astral, the title track, and the closer, Suttings Mjad Percolator. Sorry again, but again, pretty much point is, this album, top to bottom, when it comes down to, again, the black metal era, this is some really good stuff. Granted, like I said, just not as memorable as the first 2, but a little bit better than Eld, I would say, at least in my opinion. And that's why it goes up a spot to my number 14. So, again, pretty much touring, writing, recording. They would go back to the studio in February of 2000, once again working with Peter Tägtgren at the production helm, and released on September 25th of 2000, we would get Mardron Beyond the Within. This one's my number 13. We're moving up. We're moving up a little bit. But this is still another great album. Again, this is a tough one to rank because you can honestly arrange a lot of these albums into however order you want, and I don't think you would necessarily be wrong. Maybe except for my last place one, which we'll talk about soon. But this is still fantastic stuff. Again, more black metal. But this is kind of the beginnings of where they would become, or what they would become, and that's more of that progressive black metal. Granted, it's only little bits and pieces here and there where it gets proggy, but it's still very much just straight up black metal with some of that Viking folk instrumentation, but little hints of prog, especially in like the lush melodies that kind of creep its way in there, especially on the opening track, which is 10 minutes. Store in Tid, Tingri in Not, I believe that's how you say it, I don't know. Entrance Escape, which is one of the only tracks up to this point in English as far as the song titles and even the lyrics, even though there's not very many lyrics, but one of the only songs during the black metal era that's in English. The title track, Ormgard, again, just brilliant songs when it comes down to the black metal era. But again, as I keep saying, I know I'm sounding like a broken record, but when you compare it to the first two albums, it doesn't quite hold up. But still, fantastic, highly recommended, and it's my number 13. So, again, brief little bits of touring going on here and there before they would go back to the studio at the end of the summer of 2001, and they would actually return to Python. They actually would work with Python for the next several albums here in the first half of the 2000s era, still on Osmos Productions, and released on November 19th, 2001, we would get Monumention. Now, this is one of them cases where something has to come in last, and this is that album. This is my number 16. It seems to be the last place for a lot of people, but don't take that as like, oh, I don't like it or it's a bad album. Of course not. It's good. It's a good album, but definitely the production not quite as strong on this album, and also they were maybe trying to experiment a little bit, considering this was really when they started going the more progressive black metal route. However, I don't think they quite approached it as well as they would on even the next album coming up. But still, you got some pretty good songs on here. And also, this would be the first Enslaved album where you have English songs, English lyrics throughout the majority of the album. So now we can pronounce song titles better. So starting off with Convoys to Nothingness, The Voices, The Cromlech Gate, and then even the A Monuments Part 2 and 3. Where was Part 1? That's what I want to know. Where was A Monument Part 1 at? But yeah, like Part 1 being, or not Part 1, Part 2 being Vision, Sphere of the Elements, and then Part 3, The Sleep, Floating Diversity. Like, there's some really good songs that are catchy on here. It's just when it came down to putting the songs together and the production, not quite as strong as compared to the albums previous. So, like I said, this seems to be the last place for a lot of people, but it's still good. It's just, it's surrounded by great albums, which makes this one kind of stand out like a sore thumb, or stick out like a sore thumb, I should say. But still, it's really good. Even though it's last place for me, it might be better for others. But like I said, it's still good. Definitely check it out. Now, again, more touring going on, because that's what this band... Pretty much there's not really much in terms of, like, story. It was just more or less, let's just... write, record, tour, and not really taking very much in the way of breaks. Now, as far as lineup shifts, they would get a new drummer, Dirge Rep, to do the session work on this next album, and they would get second guitarist Icedale. So I'm just going to call him Icedale because, well, let me try pronouncing his real name. You know what, screw it. I'm just calling him Icedale because that's a fun name to say. So they would return to the studio once again in the fall of 2002, and they wouldn't be able to get this album mixed until January 2003, and then finally released on May 5th, 2003, we would get Below the Lights. Now, this one fell for me. This is my number 12. Even though it's a great album, I did actually have this a lot higher at one point, but then it fell whenever I got into some of the later albums that I didn't really give full attention to. But this is still fantastic. Like, I would say from this point on, every album's brilliant when it comes down to the progressive black metal era, which is my cup of tea. When it comes to Enslaved, is when they really get lush and heavy and even dissonant, but getting quite diverse within the songwriting. I would say this is the real beginnings of that, whereas it was hinted at on Mardrum, then they tried it on Monumention, but not really approached the best. Whereas here, I think they perfected what they were trying to go for on Monumention and really expand on it. Into production, a little bit better this time around. But yeah, great tracks on here like The Crossing, Queen of Night. Heavenless was actually the first Enslaved song I ever heard, courtesy of Metal Headbanger's Journey, and it's still a great song, and it's one of the catchiest too, especially the vocals at the beginning, like the clean vocals that Grudley is doing, which feel more like chants than anything else. But still, brilliant album, and like I said, from this point on, like, everything here is pretty much masterful. Even though this ranks lower on my list in the lower half, still great. It's my number 12. So, more writing, recording, touring, and all this and that coming up for the next year. However, we would get a change-up of record labels. No longer on Osmos Productions. They would go over to Taboo Recordings, at least for this album and maybe the next one. Actually, I don't think so. And this would, I believe, be the last album to be produced by Python. This would be it for him, and he would not work with Enslaved again after this album. But they went back to work with Python in the studio during the late summer of 2004, and then released on October 25th, 2004, we would get Isa. This is my number 6. Holy shit, did it get heavier, more dynamic, and more epic, I would say, especially when it comes down to, like, the proggy sections. And then also, more lineup shifts. We would get new drummer, Kato Beckvold. I probably screwed that up. And then we would actually get a keyboardist / clean vocalist in Herbrand Larson, who would remain in the band for quite a number of years and albums. And he definitely adds a lot of dynamics, whereas Grudley, when it comes to the cleans, it's more of like a low chant, whereas if you're going to go into the more progressive terrain, you're going to need a vocalist who could probably do more in the range to, like, accentuate the music that's going on. And Herbrand actually does a very good job, and I think he would get better as a vocalist as the albums go on during the time he's there. But, like, the title track was another one of the earliest Enslaved tracks I ever heard, and it's actually one of the shorter tracks. It's only under 4 minutes, but it is heavy, it is dark, yet it's got some really cool, like, vocal parts. Lunar Force was another really cool one. Ascension, Bounded by Legions. Probably the heaviest song on the album, Return to Yggdrasil. That song is just powerful. And even Neogenesis, which I think is the longest song they've ever done, at just about 12 minutes long. Chef's kiss galore. That song is absolutely brilliant. But yeah, Isa, fantastic album, my number 6. So, more the same going on, Write Record Tour, and they would return to the studio once again in 2006. Yeah, they would go into the studio at the beginning of 2006. Well, some sections record at the very end of 2005, but the bulk of the recording was at the beginning of 2006. And then released on May 8th, 2006, we would get Rune. This is my number 5 album. I think this was a step up from ISA. Not only do I think it gets a little bit heavier, but also more melodic at the same time, and also the production, I felt, was a little bit better, as the band pretty much produced it themselves, and I think they did a pretty damn good job. And this is also one of the shorter albums in their catalog. It's about 46 minutes, and the longest song as a whole on the album is at almost 7 with Apivat. But killer tracks on here again. The title track is great. Fusion of Sense and Earth. Path to Veneer. Introoper. Top to bottom. Tides of Chaos. So much great stuff going on here. And the dynamics just get better and better as also Herbrand's vocals start getting better by this point in comparison to ISA. But yeah, this is just absolutely fantastic, and this was one I've seen a lot of people rank pretty high, and I can see why. After I listen to it, I'm like, I get the hype behind it now, and it is my number 5. So, moving on, pretty much more of the same stuff going on. Right Record Tour, they would go back to the studio at the beginning of 2008 to work on this next album. This time they would get Joe Barresi to mix the album. Of course, Joe's discography of bands he's worked with is just absolutely insane and staggering. But he would come in to mix this album while the band produced it, and released September 29th, 2008 on Indie Recordings this time, as they switched up record labels once again. They would release Vertebrae. This one actually went up on my list a little bit. This is my number 11. I like this album. Originally I had it almost dead last, because I've seen a lot of people kind of downplay this album a little bit, but I don't get why. I mean, yeah, it's in the lower half, and it's my number 11, but I still think this is some fantastic stuff. Like, I think maybe the problem, the guitars, I think, do sound a little bit thin, and I think that's because they wanted to get more melodic on this album, as especially with Herbrand's vocals, again, just getting better. Especially on the closing track, The Watcher, which was the shortest song of the album at a little over 4 minutes, but it's one of my favorite Enslaved tracks. Ground, the title track, Reflection, Center. Again, top to bottom, there's not a wasted moment on here. It's just, I think maybe the reason why this one gets kind of shafted towards the bottom of people's lists is, I think, the production, when it came down to the guitars. But Joe does a good job with the mix. It's just the guitar production itself, the guitars just sound a tad thin. But still, amazing songs, continuing to get more and more progressive as we go along. And this is my number 11. Now, more recording, writing, touring, you know the deal. And this time, they would go back to the studio around the beginning of 2010, and they would find a new guy to mix their albums going forward, and that would be none other than Jens Bogren, who is one of the biggest producers in all of Sweden. But they would actually get for producing, or yeah, for the production, not only the band doing the production, but they would get Ivar Sandoy to come in to help co-produce this album, and he would be a name that pretty much stays with Enslaved going forward. And released September 27th, almost 2 exact years to the date, in 2010, we get Axioma Ethica Odini. This one is my number 3. Holy shit, did these songs just get even more lush, yet heavy, dynamic, just, oh my god. A lot of people probably put this one at the top of their list. This one just comes in as my number 3 just because I think there are 2 other albums that I just like a little bit more. But this is absolutely fucking brilliant. Opening right out of the gate with your longest song at 8 minutes with Ethica Odini. Just really sets the tone for what this album is going to do to your ears, but also to your brain, I would say. Raidho, Wardrune, The Beacon, Nightside, Lightning, Singular, I mean, especially these longer tracks, they really know how to take you on a journey. And that's really kind of one of the big things about Enslaved, especially in the more prog era, since Below the Lights. They're able to take you on a majestical journey of Norse mythology and Vikings and nature. And this album, I think, really pushes that even further, especially in this more prog era of the band. But yeah, if you haven't checked this album out, what are you waiting for? My number 3. So, more of the same stuff goes on. They go back to the studio in 2012, and they would switch up record labels. They would go to Nuclear Blast Records, where they currently reside, and good on Nuclear Blast for picking these guys up. And released October 28th of 2012, we get Retire. This is my number 1. We have finally reached my number 1. And also, it's the longest album in their catalog. This is over 67 minutes. But, oh my lord. Do these songs absolutely slay. Right out of the gate, thoughts like hammers, heavy riffage, but lush harmonies and melodies. And just... what more can you say about it? Death in the Eyes of Dawn, I think, was probably one of my favorite Enslaved songs going through this entire discography. Roots of the Mountain, the title track, Matterhorn, Forsaken, which is a little over 11 minutes, was a brilliant closer to really wrap this like a present. You put it all in a box, wrap it in gift wrap, and tie it up with a nice, pretty little bow to say, here you go. This is what we're all about. Here's our gift to you, the fans. Absolutely brilliant. Probably, like I said, my number 1, and I would argue maybe the best out of the progressive era of Enslaved. Number 1. So now we get into a little bit of a gap. Like, up to this point, maybe the biggest gap, I don't know, between Frost and Eld was pretty long. This is about more or less the same. So this is about 2.5 years gone by. Still on Nuclear Blast, still Jens Bogren and Ivar Sandoy doing production and mixing. And released March 10th of 2015, we would get End Times. This is my number 2 album, and honestly, this could interchange with Retired now, but End Times, this was actually the first Enslaved album I ever got, mostly thanks to the opening track, Thursass Dreaming. Maybe my personal favorite Enslaved song, like the vocal hooks from Herbrand, just wonderful, and even like some of the cool like tribal moments during like when it gets to these like big chants. Wow, I had a hiccup there. And also still retaining a lot of the black metal, like the opening riff, very much black metal centric. Building with Fire, more brilliant vocal hooks. The title track, Daylight, and this is only 6 tracks, 53 minutes, but every song delivers and then some. This is absolutely fantastic progressive black metal from Enslaved. And I know I'm not going into too much detail because basically I can't even do these justice with just words. So yeah, this one, my number 2. So now we move ahead another 2.5 years, and they would go back to the studio in 2017, and released on October 11th, 2017. Actually, before we get there, a little bit of a lineup shift. Herbrand Larson, gone, and in his place would be Håkon Vinje. I probably butchered that. He would come in, take over on keyboards and clean vocals, and released October 11th, 2017, we would get E. This one's my number 10. This is right in the middle, and I feel the reason why it went down as much as it did on the list is because it's following up on 3 absolutely brilliant genre-defining albums for progressive black metal. And this one, while still fantastic, just doesn't quite hold my attention compared to the previous 3, but still brilliant tracks on here, like the opening song, Storm Sun, which is about 11 minutes, Axis of the Worlds, Hindsight. Like, again, every song, it's fantastic. It's just, like I said, what it's following is very, very difficult. But still, amazing album. Just because it's ranked at 10 doesn't mean it's, like, worse off. Again, pretty much almost all of these albums are brilliant, even though Monumention, like I said, last place, it's still pretty damn good. But he comes in as my number 10. So we move ahead, and now we get to the longest gap, 3 years. Exact, almost. 3 years since E was released, and then also by this point with Enslaved, as they would go back to the studio. They actually went into the studio in late 2019. However, this album would get delayed because of the pandemic. It would get delayed until October 2nd of 2020. And then we get another lineup shift. We get a new drummer, and that's Ivar Sandoy. Yeah, Ivar Sandoy, who had been one of the producers. Now he's in as drummer and also helping out on clean vocals and keyboards with Hakan. And released October 2nd of 2020, we get Utgard. This one's my number 9. I think this is a little bit better than E. I think it's a little heavier as well. Like, there were definitely, like, moments on here that made me think of, like, Celtic Frost to some degree, especially with some of the swinging grooves that come in here and there. But yeah, this is probably, I think, the second shortest album. I think the shortest was Bloodhem. This is just barely 45 minutes, and the songs are a little bit shorter. Like, the longest track is nearly 6 minutes, 40 seconds in that sequence. But Fires in the Dark, Yetgreita, there's some Norwegian titles making their return, Utgaror, Yrjoden, I think, but Storms of Utgard, Distant Seasons, again, just wonderful fucking songs. I know I'm sounding like a broken record, but that's just basically everything. Enslaved just can't do any wrong, it just feels like. And this album, if I recall, this was near the top of my best of 2020 on the Horseman podcast. If not, that needs to change, because this is absolutely fantastic. Great follow-up, and a little bit better than E, at least in my opinion. But it is my number 9. Again, we're after everything settled down with the pandemic and they were allowed to do stuff again. They actually spent a long time in the studio, considering, well, they couldn't really tour, so they decided, how about we just make some new songs and we'll just work on them more and see what happens. So they were actually in the studio from January 2021 until April 2022, recording all this, and then taking their time with the mixing and mastering with Jens Bogren once again, really crafting their next masterwork. And released just this year on March 3rd, we get Heimdall. I actually reviewed this album when it came out back in March, so if you want to know my full opinion, go watch that review and you'll understand. But right now, this sits as my number 8. And yeah, right dead in the middle, but this was one of the albums I've given a perfect score to this year, and I still stand by that. Like, this is definitely pushing more towards progressive rock mixed with black metal, where it's still heavy and there's still a lot of black metal, but there's a lot more, like, and I would say Utgard kind of began, like, not as much prog metal, but a little bit more prog rock mixed with black metal, as opposed to prog metal mixed with black metal. But fantastic top to bottom, like all 7 tracks. And I also love how, even on a couple of tracks, they get into thrash metal territory where they go really fast with the riffs and the rhythms. Just absolutely going to town on everything that they were going for here. But again, if you want to know my full opinion, check out my review. Don't be shocked if it's on my year-end list. You know what? Screw it. It's going to be on my year-end list. Just wait for it. But yeah, my number 8. And of course, ladies and gentlemen, that does it for my ranking of all things Enslaved. 16 albums worth of stuff to go through, but I really enjoyed going through pretty much all these albums. I didn't really go back as much with Utgard and Heimdall because I already had a hunch about, or even Issa, because I already had a hunch about where they would end up. It was basically the other albums that I needed to kind of dive deeper into. But I'm glad I got this one done. Actually, this was supposed to have been made back around the spring, so it would have been very shortly after Heimdall. Now I'm glad that I waited this long because more time has passed, and here we are with the ranking. So, we're almost done with this year in terms of rankings, and actually, before I get out of your hair, if you go over to the community tab on my YouTube page, you will scroll down a little bit. There are some polls going on right now where I'm allowing you guys, once again, to choose what bands that you guys want me to cover for discography rankings next year. So there's 4 polls. The 2 most voted ones will be selected. So you got 4 polls, 1 for death metal bands, 1 for black metal bands, 1 for thrash metal bands, and 1 for progressive metal bands. And like I said, the top 2 most voted will be the ones that will get discography rankings. So there will be 8 total next year in 2024. But as far as what's left to cover this year, around this time next month, towards Halloween, I'm going to be talking Judas Priest. That's going to be a rabbit hole. 19 albums. Even though I kind of have a feeling how they're going to be ranked, and I don't even really need to go back and listen to a lot of them, just some of them. And then towards the holiday season, we'll have a little break in between Judas Priest and the band I'm talking about in December. But in December, I'm going to be talking Edge of Sanity. But that's going to be then. Until next time, what did you guys think of my ranking? What are your rankings? Let me know in the comments below. And until next time, keep your horns high and your dreams wet.